Jonathan Reed, an American man over 50 journeys deep into the Mongolian steppes, encounters a tribe and is astonishingly asked by three sisters to impregnate them to continue their lineage. Jonathan Reed, an American man over 50, had worked in the finance department of a rather successful mid-sized company. However, his marriage had long since broken down, and he had endured many hardships in life. One day, he wrapped up his business, deciding to travel the world before it was too late. He had few family ties, and the fact that he had never truly left the United States further spurred him on. After his divorce, his heart was complicated and bewildered, but at 50 years old, he finally packed his bags and embarked on a journey abroad. Initially, he had considered Southeast Asia or Europe, but suddenly, the Mongolian steppes he'd seen in a documentary clearly came to mind. There, the horizon stretched endlessly, and people still led nomadic lives and untouched wild civilization. Jonathan Reed wanted to immerse himself in that landscape. He wanted to feel freedom in a strange land. An acquaintance told him that besides urban areas, Mongolia had vast grasslands, deserts, and rugged terrain, making travel very difficult. However, the more he heard, the stronger his curiosity grew. He happened to meet a Mongolian language translator in an online community who informed him that in the western and northwestern regions, there were still some minority tribes with almost no contact with the outside world. Upon arriving in Ulaanbaatar, Jonathan Reed slowly began to move westward. He rented a car for his use and learned some basic Mongolian greetings from a translator and dictionary he had prepared in the United States. He anticipated that English proficiency would be low, but he believed there would always be a way to manage. After touring Ulaanbaatar and nearby small towns for a few days, he ventured into more remote areas. As he moved further from the city, the roads became increasingly dilapidated, and his cell phone signal vanished. However, Jonathan Reed felt more relief than anxiety. It seemed as though the bustling life in the United States, the wounds from his divorce, and the judging eyes of others had all disappeared. Now it was just him and the vast expanse of land. After driving for several hours on unpaved roads, a desolate landscape suddenly unfolded. Strong winds howled, dust swirled, and there were no signs of villages except for some dimly visible ridges in the distance. He had brought a certain amount of food, water, and vehicle fuel, but he didn't know when or where a village would appear. A slight fear crept in that he might be isolated in the heart of the steppes. However, from the moment he left, he knew it was a dangerous journey. Wolves or wild dogs roaming the steppes, unpredictable weather accidents of getting lost, none of it was easy. Jonathan Reed opened his map again in the car, trying to find a place where a known landmark might appear, but he had even lost his sense of accurate positioning, confused by the rugged terrain. On this desolate plain, where even a fallen needle would be hard to find, he decided to trust his intuition and continue. One afternoon, after driving for another half day, he saw what appeared to be small dots in the distance. Upon closer inspection, it seemed to be a small settlement of several yurts. Jonathan Reed was exhausted from the hot sun, but seeing this sight, he felt a wave of relief. If this was a cluster of yurts inhabited by Mongolian nomads, he could at least find people, water, and a place to sleep. As he drove closer, he saw about 8 yurts scattered around. Goats and sheep grazed nearby, and people glanced at him. Jonathan Reed slowly got out of the car and greeted them in clumsy Mongolian. He tried to greet them in English, hoping it would be understood, but the reaction was a bit awkward. However, it wasn't an atmosphere of outright repulsion towards strangers. Several people approached and gestured for him to join them. That evening, through clumsy communication, he indicated he was American and traveling. The villagers seemed surprised and offered him roasted lamb and milk tea. Jonathan Reed was very grateful and clumsily expressed his goodwill by giving them some American snacks and small souvenirs he carried. This village was a very small tribe. They called themselves Tuvanai and said they had long lived a nomadic life centered in this region. Jonathan Reed couldn't understand the details, but he roughly gathered their situation through a mix of Mongolian, a few English words, and their gestures. There were almost no young men in the village, mostly children, middle-aged, and elderly women and elders. That night, as he slept in one of the yurts, he wondered, why are there no young men? They might have left for the cities to find work, or there could be other reasons. Jonathan Reed simply let it be without any particular suspicion. He still planned to stay for a day or two and then leave. The next morning, the villagers suggested showing him around the village, but Jonathan Reed declined. They then gestured to him the well and animal grazing areas, though without fully verbalizing it. Then, in front of one yurt, he discovered 3 young women he hadn't expected. They all appeared to be in their early 20s, much younger than Jonathan Reed. They looked very similar, but each exuded a different charm. The first had thick black hair half tied up and appeared tall and serene. The second had brown hair and an impressively bright smile and seemed very lively. The third had neat braids and quietly exchanged glances. Later, he learned these 3 were sisters named Altan Saran and Chimeg respectively. A middle-aged woman in the village seemed to be introducing Jonathan Reed to the sisters. When Jonathan Reed greeted them, the 3 sisters looked at him with curious expressions and smiled. Notably, the second sister, Saran, blurted out a short English, "Hello," to which Jonathan Reed replied, "Hello, nice to meet you," eliciting a burst of laughter. It seemed English wouldn't be fully understood, but basic greetings were fine. Thus, he naturally had the opportunity to converse with the sisters. Altan spoke almost no English, making translation difficult, but Saran helped out. She had briefly visited Ulaanbaatar in her childhood and had some exposure to English. The third sister, Chimeg, was shy and spoke little, but she looked at Jonathan Reed as one would a stranger. That afternoon, Jonathan Reed visited the nearby pastures with the sisters. They also watched the villagers herd livestock across the steppes. Saran explained the village life in simple English. She mentioned the scarcity of men that most young men had left and gradually told him about the village's ancient traditions. Jonathan Reed was curious. "So, how do you marry and have children?" Saran replied with a subtle expression and a smile. "Our tribe has a special custom. Sometimes we have relations with foreign men to procreate. The details are hard to explain." Altan also whispered to her in Mongolian beside her, then gave Jonathan Reed a shy smile. At that moment, Jonathan Reed felt a chill. There's a custom of having relations with foreign men and bearing children, and here were 3 sisters with almost no young men in the village. He had a ridiculous thought that they might want to ask him to do something similar. However, he just brushed it off as a joke. Could such a thing really happen? Originally, Jonathan Reed's plan was to stay in this village for a day or 2, then continue westward. However, the villagers showed warm hospitality, and he wanted to gather more interesting stories while gradually communicating with Saran. So he decided to stay for a few more days, check his car, and stock up on supplies. Furthermore, the weather on the steppes was unpredictable, so resting for a while was also a good idea. Days passed like this. Jonathan Reed grew closer to the 3 sisters. None of the 3 were married and were the most promising young women remaining in the family. As the eldest daughter, Altan, was responsible for faithfully carrying out the livestock management and household chores assigned by the tribal elders. The lively Saran was curious about external culture and city life, so she constantly asked Jonathan Reed about the United States and looked at photos stored on his phone. The youngest, Chimeg, was quiet, but often had Saran translate with a gentle smile and a charming tone. Every day, the 3 sisters invited Jonathan Reed to their yurt, or around the village had him sit beside them and showed him various things. He watched with awe the methods of riding horses or goats, the structure inside the yurts, the process of handling firewood, and the making of traditional Mongolian food, which he experienced for the first time. Among them, Altan's meticulous guidance to Jonathan Reed was particularly impressive. As the eldest daughter, she tried to explain step by step, and Jonathan Reed grew fond of her calm demeanor. One day at a casual gathering, many village women and some elders watched Jonathan Reed and burst into laughter. Jonathan Reed didn't know why, but it seemed they were talking about him. Saran, standing next to him, smiled and said, "Foreign men are precious here, especially since there are almost no young men. The villagers think you're remarkable." Jonathan Reed smiled awkwardly and nodded. However, Saran stated frankly, "If you allow, we can hold a special ceremony in our village and have children." This left Jonathan Reed bewildered. In an instant his heart sank as he understood what this implied. While it was too early to make hasty assumptions, he couldn't shake the feeling that the sisters might all want him to stay and have children. A few days later, Jonathan Reed was invited to the three sisters' yurt. Before that, he had mainly stayed in a middle-aged couple's yurt, but the sisters requested a long talk in their yurt that night. Altan prepared a special soup, using ingredients difficult to obtain in the city. The soup, full of lamb and vegetables, tasted better than he expected, which impressed Jonathan Reed. After the meal, Jonathan Reed and the three sisters drank tea in the dimly lit yurt, engaging in a fervent conversation. Saran was responsible for translating. Then Altan looked at Jonathan Reed with a meaningful gaze and carefully opened her mouth. The following is what was roughly conveyed by Saran in English. This village has a very ancient family tradition. Due to the absolute shortage of men, when an outsider comes in, he is treated with certain kindness. If the man is willing, several women, such as three sisters or two sisters, will simultaneously form a relationship with him and bear children. If the man is willing, he can stay with the tribe or leave. Regardless, the children are the responsibility of the women and the village community. The man doesn't have to feel burdened by his children remaining in the village. Of course, if you stay, because you feel responsible, the atmosphere will be better. Listening to this story, Jonathan Reed could hardly believe it, saying, "Does such a custom truly exist?" Some people in the world had heard that such things occasionally happened even in some remote parts of Mongolia, but experiencing it directly, he felt it was surreal. But Altan added, "We are three sisters, each of us lives alone, and in fact without young men, it's hard for our families to survive. I know this would be a burden for you, but it would be wonderful if we could have children together." This was indeed a bold proposition. Not one, but all three sisters wanted to have his children. Jonathan Reed felt embarrassed and thought to himself, "I'm over 50. This is impossible in America. Besides, I don't know how I'd take responsibility if I actually had children." Saran, hearing this, said, "We can't force you to stay. This is just an option. If you wish, you can live with us, or you can leave. This is how we've always lived." He had anticipated some of it, but was still shocked to hear it. The three sisters looked at Jonathan Reed with slightly shy expressions. Chimeg seemed to be quietly lowering her head, her ears slightly reddened. All three had beautiful features and healthy complexions, exuding an exotic charm when dressed in traditional Mongolian attire. It was incredible that such sisters simultaneously wanted him to father their children, and that this was a custom permitted by the village. Jonathan Reed sighed, saying, "I can't refuse, but I can't accept immediately either. This proposal is too unusual." Altan nodded and said, "We usually don't make such suggestions to foreigners. In fact, long ago an outsider had a child this way and left. But since then, no men have come for a long time, so we don't want to miss this opportunity either. Saran said, "Don't feel burdened. If you truly don't want to, you can leave now." Jonathan Reed hesitated and asked for some time. The three sisters understood, saying, "Please stay a while longer and consider it carefully." However, the village atmosphere already seemed filled with anticipation, as if a foreign man had finally entered their family. He had the impression that if he stayed a few more days, a wedding would naturally take place. His heart was complex. First, he wasn't accustomed to such unconventional relationships. In the conventional American way of thinking, a man marrying three sisters simultaneously was absurd. Moreover, he worried about how he would take responsibility if he actually had children. Of course, the tribe allowed men to leave, but Jonathan Reed was tormented by the thought of whether he should abandon his own children and depart. However, even if he completely refused, Jonathan Reed's own situation was a problem. Back in the United States, he had no special relationships, nor stable work or wealth. If he settled here and started a new life adapting to the Mongolian language or lifestyle, wouldn't be easy, but freely building a family on the steppes was a unique option. The three sisters were beautiful and had shown him warm hospitality. Jonathan Reed had already grown comfortable with them and secretly developed feelings for them. One day, Altan quietly visited the yurt where he was staying. It was after everyone else had fallen asleep. Altan seemed somewhat reserved during the day, but when she spoke quietly at night, she was surprisingly candid. She said, "I know you're over 50, but that's not an issue. In the village, women have united with older men before. What we need is a healthy child to continue the family and trust in a man." John countered, "Are you really okay with this? I'm old, and my body might not be as healthy as it used to be." Altan laughed and said, "I don't think you're past your prime." After talking with Altan late into the night, Jonathan Reed felt his heart gradually opening. Among the three sisters, Altan possessed a cautious and responsible charm like an eldest daughter. If he were to live here, he also imagined building a family in cooperation with Altan. In the following days, Saran approached Jonathan Reed more actively. Saran, who spoke English, said casually, "You can leave with me. We can go to the city together." "I want to go to the United States," she suddenly suggested. She was very curious about what the United States was like. Jonathan Reed was surprised by this unexpected answer and asked, "Could you really abandon this village?" Saran smiled vaguely and said, "Altan will protect the village, and Chimeg isn't sure yet. But I'm curious about cities and foreign lands." Chimeg still didn't say much, but her face would quickly redden when Jonathan Reed was nearby. Then one day, while fetching water during the day, Chimeg suddenly held Jonathan Reed's hand and quietly smiled when they were alone. Jonathan Reed's heart pounded, and Chimeg softly mumbled, "I like you too," in a very faint and gentle voice. After all, no more specific words were exchanged, but in that moment his whole body was filled with excitement. He felt that even without words, her feelings had been conveyed. Jonathan Reed ultimately narrowed his choices to two. First, he could refuse the three sisters' request and leave. They had said that without men, it would be difficult to have children, and the family would gradually decline, but he wouldn't have to bear responsibility. Second, he could respect their customs and hold a wedding. Even if children were born afterward, the sisters and the village community would care for them, so he wouldn't need to bear the burden. Of course, he could stay and live with them. Deep within him, curiosity and a strange attraction continued to grow. In his 50 years of life, he had never imagined such a thing. In the United States, such a thing would be highly illegal and publicly condemned, and a man marrying three sisters simultaneously was absurd. But here, it was a natural custom. Moreover, the three sisters were all pure and beautiful. They were very amiable. Most importantly, Jonathan Reed himself was tired of his past work life and married life and wanted to find a new life. So perhaps this was destiny. Finally, he conveyed his intentions to the three sisters through Altan. "If you truly wish it, and if I am capable, I will follow that custom." Upon hearing these words, the three sisters were overjoyed, embracing him and covering their eyes. It was as if a long-standing mission had been resolved. Jonathan Reed tried to remain calm on the surface, but his heart was pounding. The thought of what he was doing swept through his body. After that, the village elders immediately began preparations. Originally, when such a wedding was held for a family, they would share food like a simple festival, playing traditional music and dancing. This case was somewhat unusual. A man marrying three sisters simultaneously was rare, but this also meant that this family could be grandly welcomed. One day, a large bonfire was lit in the center of the steppes. Elders and women representing the families sat in a circle beating drums and other percussion instruments and reciting words of congratulation. About 30 villagers gathered, and the three sisters surrounded Jonathan Reed in the center. They wore coats similar to traditional attire, without complex decorations, but adorned with bright Mongolian-style colors. The ceremony wasn't long. The elders simply spoke a few words of congratulation. The brides bowed gently to Jonathan Reed and then circulated cups. Jonathan Reed also drank a golden beverage like the village's traditional wine. His stomach grew warm. People clapped their hands with joyful smiles, and the drum beats grew louder. Lamb bread and milk tea were immediately served, and like a simple feast, some people also danced. The festivities continued after sunset, and Jonathan Reed moved with the three sisters to a specially prepared yurt on one side of the village. Several people had already come here and arranged it meticulously. They had created a space large enough for the three sisters and one man to live together. Jonathan Reed, with a slightly flushed face, heard Altan say, "From today on, you will live with us." Saran then smiled and said, "From now on we are a family. Isn't that wonderful?" Chimeg quietly nodded, but her eyes sparkled. As night deepened, moonlight and lantern light flickered within the yurt. The three sisters sat beside Jonathan Reed, one by one. A night unimaginable in his former American life. Altan, looking at him, said, "We are not greatly influenced by things like order or rules. However, you only need to be considerate of each other. I hope to have a child, but it's not compulsory." Jonathan Reed nodded with a nervous yet excited heart. Their cohabitation thus began. The first few days were unfamiliar and cautious, but gradually settled into a routine. The three sisters took turns spending nights with Jonathan Reed, and they also chatted together. Altan had a serious and guardian-like presence. Saran was energetic and charming, while Chimeg was shy, but would occasionally give him a friendly physical touch. For Jonathan Reed, every day was a heart-pounding one, unsure of what would happen. About a month later, John began to live with the sisters and actively participate in village affairs. When the sisters were mobilized to feed livestock, maintain yurts, fetch water, and harvest herbs in the mountains, he also worked alongside them. In the process, he often heard people jokingly say that he was now completely their family's son-in-law. He also felt the village atmosphere trying to accept him like a brother, regardless of age. Sometimes Altan would take Jonathan Reed to the steppes to practice horseback riding. As he calmly rode a horse and galloped across the steppes, the vast land and sky seemed to merge. Jonathan Reed recalled his previous life in the United States, buried among skyscrapers, and thought it was the first time he had felt such freedom. Saran was always smiling and often asked Jonathan Reed, "Do you have American food? Show me American pop music videos on your smartphone." Since there was no internet signal in the village, he could only show saved files. Saran watched the videos with great interest and happily said, "I want to wear clothes like that too." Jonathan Reed said, "If I have the chance to go back to the United States, I'll definitely take you." And Saran's eyes lit up, shouting, "Promise." Chimeg remained quiet, but sometimes when she was alone with Jonathan Reed, she would become very endearing. Especially when he helped with firewood or laundry, she would quietly come over and hand him a small handkerchief, saying, "Are you tired? Take a rest." Whenever this happened, Jonathan Reed felt overwhelmed. The three were different, but they all gave him care and love. One day, Altan said she had been feeling nauseous and vomiting since morning. At first he thought nothing of it, but after a day or two, she was examined by an elderly woman in the village. The result was pregnancy. Altan was shocked, as if by a bolt from the blue, but at the same time she also showed a look of relief. Finally, a child was coming. According to family tradition, this was a very good thing, and in fact Altan herself had been waiting for the time of childbirth. Altan made a loving joke to Jonathan Reed, saying, "It seems you've sown your seeds well." Jonathan Reed was startled, thinking in shock, "Am I really going to be a father?" He thought the probability was low because of his age, but before the mysteries of nature, human calculations were futile. But this joy was short-lived, as a few days later Saran also complained of similar symptoms. Saran joked with a laugh, "I wonder if I'm pregnant too." But when the elderly woman examined her, it was indeed pregnancy. He could hardly believe it. Jonathan Reed was speechless for a moment. Altan and Saran were confirmed pregnant with only a half-month interval. The sisters embraced, cheering excitedly while massaging their bellies. A family celebration erupted. The youngest Chimeg was also confirmed pregnant about a month later. Not long after all three sisters were pregnant in quick succession. Jonathan Reed himself could hardly believe this was possible. Although already over 50, he not only had one child, but was having children with three sisters. "The sisters are truly a miracle," he said with tears in his eyes, expressing gratitude. The villagers were immersed in a festive atmosphere. It was said that 3 children were coming at once, so they held a feast, even preparing a cow to mark the occasion. The elders were delighted, saying, "It's been a long time since such a golden age." Jonathan Reed felt embarrassed by the attention of the whole world focused on him, but at the same time, he also felt proud and responsible. In the early stages of pregnancy, they all experienced morning sickness, fatigue, and dizziness. Jonathan Reed carefully looked after them. He reduced his other tasks and did his best to ensure the sisters had no difficulties with food and followed the prenatal care methods taught by the village elders. Most importantly, providing prenatal care for 3 pregnant women simultaneously in an inland village rather than a city hospital was difficult. However, this place had a long-standing knack for childbirth without external medical care. People were optimistic that women who had delivered children for decades could do so without any major issues. The sisters seemed filled with joy, even though they complained of some discomfort. As their bellies gradually grew, they would gather every day to chat, saying, "We'll be having babies soon." Every evening, as Jonathan Reed talked with the 3 sisters, he felt complex emotions. When he felt happy and excited, the question, "Am I really going to live here forever?" kept surfacing. The sisters said, "You don't have to stay forever, but it would be great if you could live with us for a few years after the children are born. It would be too difficult for us to manage on our own," they said honestly. Chimeg shyly said, "I initially said you could leave, but actually all 3 of us hope you'll stay in the village." Jonathan Reed was swayed. "Okay," he said. "I promise not to leave for now." A few more days passed, and when Altan, Saran, and Chimeg were about 4 to 5 months pregnant, a sandstorm and other natural disasters struck the village. Yurts shook, and livestock were startled and ran off. The sisters had to endure the chaos in their heavy state. Jonathan Reed quickly drove moving the goats and sheep to a safe place and removed rolling stones around the yurts, carrying out protection efforts. Thanks to this, they passed through without major damage, but the sisters were so surprised that they felt they had hovered between life and death. That night, all three embraced Jonathan Reed, murmuring, "What would we do without you?" Jonathan Reed comforted his sisters, saying, "I will protect you. I will do my best, no matter the circumstances." He cherished them even more, as each of the three was carrying a child. The entire village clearly showed its dependence on him. Finally, the delivery dates approached. First, Altan felt labor pains with her full belly, and the elderly women prepared in the yurt, using simple birthing methods. Jonathan Reed's hands and feet trembled nervously, but as he saw Altan struggling in immense pain, he felt the urge to do something. Fortunately, the elderly woman with decades of experience guided the entire process well, and after a few hours, the strong cry of a baby was heard. A baby was born. Altan's hair was disheveled with sweat, but she smiled faintly as she held the baby. Jonathan Reed's eyes also grew hot, and he was speechless. His memory of perhaps having experienced childbirth once in the United States resurfaced, but this was now a child born in a completely different environment, with a completely different woman. He was overwhelmed by the infinitely tiny and mysterious life. A few weeks later, Saran also gave birth to a child through a similar process. It was said that, true to her lively self, even during labor pains, she would mix in jokes like, "Save me, I'm dying," which made people laugh. As soon as the baby was born, she almost lost all her strength, but upon hearing the baby's cry, she immediately sobered up. "I can't believe this is my baby." Saran shed tears as she caressed the baby's fingers. Jonathan Reed also watched nervously nearby this time, and when it was all safely over, his legs almost gave out. Finally, the youngest Chimeg gave birth to a child. The three babies were born with approximately 3 months between each birth. Chimeg didn't make much noise during labor pains as she wasn't very vocal. Instead, she held back her tears, and whenever the elderly women said, "You must be more energetic, don't cry, give me strength," she quietly complied, and at a certain moment, the baby came into the world. Chimeg embraced the baby and said, "John, you did well. You're truly wonderful," and tightly squeezed his hand. Finally, the sisters successively gave birth to each child. It was a series of births happening at different times, but all within just a few months. The village was overjoyed, reaching a fever pitch. 3 babies being born in such a short time was excellent, meaning future generations would become even more prosperous. They congratulated them, saying the family's life had grown stronger. Jonathan Reed felt the joy and responsibility of becoming a father. Honestly, it was hard to believe he was raising 3 newborns, but thanks to the sisters' unity and the village community's help, things progressed smoothly. Every morning, he would be woken by the baby's cries, but his fatigue would disappear when he saw the children adorably suckling. Now the sisters and Jonathan Reed lived in the same yurt, caring for the 3 children together. Since the babies woke up in shifts every night, the 3 sisters took turns caring for one baby, and sometimes Jonathan Reed would hug and comfort 1 or 2. This was a situation he could never have imagined in the United States, but here it was common for several people to live in one yurt, and because the entire family raised the children together, it was less difficult. Naturally, Jonathan Reed became very busy. Early in the morning, while the sisters were feeding the babies, he would go out of the village to chop firewood or tend to the livestock. When Jonathan Reed returned, the sisters would report, "You've worked hard. Our babies are doing such and such today." The village elders would occasionally come to check on the baby's health and praise Jonathan Reed, saying, "He truly is a remarkable man. He's still working so hard at his age." Sometimes Saran would hum American pop songs to lull the babies to sleep. Altan, like a mature adult, would responsibly plan, even while raising the children, worrying about how to prepare clothes when they were slightly older, or how to obtain milk or formula. Chimeg quietly and silently watched the babies, and at some point she would quietly tell Jonathan Reed that she was grateful for him embracing the family's children so fully. In such daily life, Jonathan Reed felt he was being reborn. He had shed his divorce pain and stagnation from the United States and built a completely different family in a completely different place. Furthermore, with 3 newborns born carrying his seed simultaneously, he had become the center of a large family he had never imagined. Sometimes he would miss civilization. He thought of food from his homeland, the United States' comfortable shower facilities, and internet connection. But the innocent smiles of the sisters and children made the regrets disappear. Moreover, there was no fierce competition here, no worries about money, and no corporate superiors. Of course, there was difficult physical labor and the danger of natural disasters, but there was a warmth of communal living here. As the newborns became more stable and postpartum recovery was achieved, Jonathan Reed began seriously discussing long-term residence with his sisters. Now that the children are growing a bit, shouldn't they consider city life for their education? And in other aspects, Saran actively agreed. I want to live in the city once and teach the children to write. Altan cautiously agreed, saying, Our village has no schools or hospitals, so moving to the city, or at least closer to a town, might be the right thing to do at some point. Chimeg also nodded slightly. However, the issues were money and legal matters. Even if they only moved within Mongolia, they would have to go to Ulaanbaatar to find housing, or rooms, and living expenses wouldn't be easy either. Furthermore, if Jonathan Reed was considering going back to the United States, complicated administrative procedures, such as the children's birth certificates and the sisters' visas, could become a problem. Altan said, If you're willing, I'd like to go abroad with you, but all 3 of us would have to go at the same time, and with 3 children. She shook her head. Jonathan Reed thought it wasn't the stage to make a decision yet. First, let's let the children do better here and discuss it in detail again when they're a bit older and can travel. I can go back to the United States to prepare a certain amount of money, or I can first live in a Mongolian city, he suggested. The sisters all agreed with this viewpoint. The village elders also said, If raising the children becomes inconvenient for you, you can leave for the city on your own. We wish for you to stay, but we respect your freedom. Jonathan Reed was somewhat moved by these words, and on the other hand, he also felt apologetic. Even if he were to leave, one day would they be okay? However, they seemed adaptable, as they had long experienced situations where outside men came in and only left behind children. Ultimately, Jonathan Reed, the sisters, and the newborns lived as one large family under one roof, continuing the village's communal life. When the babies were about 1 year old, it was noisy and bustling, but Jonathan Reed felt happy seeing the sisters take turns caring for them. Here was a peaceful family harmony he couldn't have achieved in the United States. These days, he would sometimes drive an SUV to areas near the city, or at least find a hospital in town to get them vaccinated. Each time, the 3 sisters and 3 children accompanied him. The car was crowded. At the hospital, the doctor smiled and said, "Oh, a father having 3 newborns at once, that's truly amazing." Jonathan Reed's language wasn't very fluent, but he could communicate roughly because the sisters would translate. Thus, he gradually interacted with external civilization. Even in the village with 3 babies born, there was much energy. The adults were very satisfied, remarking that after a long time, the house was finally filled with the cries of children. Jonathan Reed had also reached a stage where he didn't hesitate to exchange drinks and jokes with several people in the village. He was no longer a traveler who stayed for only a few days and left. He felt he was now a true member. Sometimes at night, he would build a fire in front of the yurt and gaze at the stars thinking, "How did my life unfold this way? I simultaneously gained the freedom I so yearned for and new love and responsibilities." Even in strong winds with the sisters beside him, the yurt where the children slept felt like a sanctuary that couldn't be exchanged for anything in the world. The noisy and complex civilization seemed long forgotten, and the Mongolian land and wind embraced him. Sometimes he felt disheartened because he had no place to return to, but now, at least in this place, he had 3 wives and 3 children, a family. When he thought of this, his heart would warm, and he felt a new sense of responsibility and hope. This family would continue for decades until the children grew up and this inland region would care for them. In the inland regions of Mongolia, the seasons flow harshly. In winter, temperatures can drop to tens of degrees below zero, and in summer, heat and sandstorms strike. Nomads have adapted and live within these conditions. Similarly, Jonathan Reed, his 3 sisters, and their children might face many trials in the future. The children might fall ill, financial difficulties might arise, or natural disasters might occur. But they would overcome it hand in hand in the name of family, and by uniting with the customs and community spirit of this Mongolian tribe. Now a newborn cried in the yurt, and the sisters busily comforted him, while Jonathan Reed also got up to help. When Saran called out, "I'll hold you today, so go comfort Chimeg's baby," Altan said, "I'll prepare the meal." Their appearance was somehow chaotic, but it was a warm and ordinary daily life of a family. There, a family dynamic completely different from the normal framework in the United States existed, yet it was filled with sincerity, caring for and cherishing each other more than anyone else. Life continued thus deep in Mongolia's boundless steppes. The sun set, and at night, glittering stars covered the entire sky. Beneath it, in a yurt lit by a small lamp, resided a man in his 50s, who had once been trapped in isolation, and his new family, whom he now had to protect. Now there were also 3 infants who had just come into this world. This family, which seemed strange at first glance, had actually transformed into a precious relationship for each other. The ending remained uncertain. This family might experience many stories and choices, but one thing Jonathan Reed realized: life is only once, and if you can achieve love and unity in any way, that is enough to be worthwhile. His encounter with the 3 sisters brought him the freedom he had been seeking and another form of responsibility. This was enough to change his life thereafter. As a result, an unconventional relationship that began with a foreigner's visit ultimately brought new vitality to inland Mongolia. The sisters each successfully continued their family line by bearing children, and the villagers also blessed them. Jonathan Reed was also considered a member of the village and gradually took root in this land. One day, even if the children grew up and left to explore the wider world, the dedication formed on the steppes in the yurt and with his new family would never change. Perhaps one day, Jonathan Reed would take the children to the United States. At that time, people around them might be surprised, saying, "Impossible, a man with 3 sisters and children." But isn't life always an unpredictable adventure? At this moment, stars twinkled over the steppes, and the yurt was filled with warmth and the laughter of family.